You know those moments when you begin to become more interested in something, aka like camels, then suddenly more and more camel things and camel people enter your realm and your new little world? Well, for our podcast guest today, Amy Christmas, her entire world and life opened up because of camels and led her to opportunities and experiences that she couldn't have dreamed up. And now, because of her challenging experiences of moving abroad to Qatar from the UK and trying to gain information on camels, yes, even in a Middle Eastern camel country, she's now sharing stories from women all over the world on their experiences and challenges within the world of camels. Join this conversation with me, Tara, and Amy Christmas from One Woman Caravan. You're going to love this episode, so stay tuned for more. Amy Christmas, welcome to our podcast. We met back in, was it 18 or 19? 19.
18.
Oh, was that?
Oh, 18.
18, yeah. And we were in India because you had signed up for our crazy adventure in India where we were training camels and walking to the Pushkar Camel Fair. And I was immediately fascinated by you because, at first I didn't know you originally from the UK, but I know that you were coming from Qatar. And that just, I'm like, this lady's got a story and we're going to share this here. So let's just start. Like, you're obviously born in the UK and how you got yourself from the UK to where you are now in Nidoa, I believe, and how really you got a camel.
Yeah. I don't have, like, when I'm doing interviews with the women, I always want to know how they got started, and my story just doesn't measure up compared to a lot of women who have these very kind of inspiring kind of origin stories. I don't have the same thing. So I mean, I was born in Britain, in the north of the UK, in a tiny farming village near Barnsley, if anyone knows it, or Sheffield, which is a slightly bigger city, but Yorkshire, so north of England. And no, I had nothing to do with camels, and I think the first camel I ever met was on a family holiday in Egypt when I was in my teenage years, and they left zero impression on me, because what leaves an impression on you when you're 15? Nothing.
Yes, except for maybe the opposite sex sometimes, or the same sex.
Boys, it was the year I met boys. So why would a camel have made any difference to my life? It didn't. I don't even have photos of it. So I obviously seen them in the zoos and stuff. Never had any interest. I did grow up with horses, and from being very young age, rode. So about 2-3 years old, I started riding. I had competition ponies when I was a kid, and my mother trains racehorses, so I was involved with that from quite a young age, mostly against my will, but as it turned out, I quite enjoyed it, so that worked out. And then obviously, you get to your teenage years, and I was losing interest in the horses because boys again, and then I went to university when I was 18, mainly as a way to escape living in a farming village, because you don't want this growing up. You want to go to the city and just reject everything. So I went to university in York, which was only about half an hour away and not a particularly big city, for anyone that knows it, but was huge for me because I was coming from a town that was like 1,000 people.
Yes.
So York was massive. And so I spent nearly 9 years in York. I got my undergraduate and PhD degrees in literature, which my parents weren't massively happy about. I mean, they were not the first person in my family to go to university, and my dad pretty much thought that university was pissing it up against the wall for 3 years.
Mm-hmm.
Can we swear on this podcast?
Yes, we can. We do.
If you want direct quotes from my dad, you're going to need to have swearing.
Yes.
So I mean, I went, and he was right actually. I mean, it really is like you go and you figure out what you want to do, and I didn't really know what I wanted to do. I know I liked writing, I know I liked stories, so in a way literature was like path of least resistance. It was something that I was good at and that I enjoyed, and that there was a degree that existed in it. So I went and I did literature, with no plan. I've never had a plan. I always fall into things by accident almost. So after graduating, I found a job. I was working at a theatre, and then that was really badly paid. And then a PhD bursary came up. So the fact that I was funded meant that I could continue studying, which I quite liked. And they were just like, well, I didn't even know what PhD stood for when I started my PhD. Honestly, I didn't know. 3 months in, I was like, oh, right, okay, great. They said they would give me money to write a long book for a few years. And I was like,
that's
okay.
right.
So I finished my PhD in 2013. And by that point, I'd got married, and I moved with my then husband to his hometown in France to finish my write-up. During that time, I got pregnant. And then we stayed there for another 9 months while I evacuated a human.
Right.
And then once he had arrived, I went straight off to China to start work because, I mean, I had no job prospects, and then suddenly I was pregnant and I needed to, So baby was 3-4 weeks old. We moved to China for me to start my first teaching job, because there are no jobs, there's no, if you want gainful employment with a PhD in literature, you better be ready to move abroad. And I was happy to do that. I mean, I've been stuck in Yorkshire for all of my childhood and adulthood. So I was ready to see a bit of the world. And China was the first place that offered me a job. Although at the time I was also applying for jobs in the Middle East. And I was quite interested. I think this is where the camel connection came, because, and I think it was a joke. I think if you ask my friends now, they say, oh, you were always talking about camels. And I was like, I don't remember that. I was
right.
But apparently somewhere along the lines, I was like, well, if we get to the Middle East, I'll have to have a look into camels, because they must be like the Middle East version of the horse. It turns out no, because they've got horses also, and camels is something different. But I didn't know that then. So we spent 2 years in China, and after that, I got offered a job in Qatar. So I came here in 2016, and pretty much immediately set about trying to find camels, because I was just, by that point, I'd been reading a bit about the culture. I'd been reading a bit about the camel, and wondered whether they still had them, what they were using them for, that kind of thing. I knew that racing was a big thing in the Middle East, particularly in the United Arab Emirates, which is next door. I didn't know what Qatar would be like. I mean, it's not really, it's been put on the map more recently because of the World Cup and things, but it's not the most famous of these oil-rich Middle Eastern states. Most people, even when I go home, people say to me, like, I'm back in the village pub, and they're like, how's it going in Dubai? And it's just got to the point where I'm like, it's great, I love it. I mean, it's a different country, but it's it's great. So coming to Doha, I didn't really know what to expect. I was expecting quite a strict, conservative Muslim society, all of that Western media dominated narrative. It's not really anything the way that people from my hometown would perceive living out here. I actually really enjoy living in Qatar, although I think for different reasons to your average white expat living in Qatar. I also hate this term as well, expat, mainly because everybody here is an expat.
I assume that, yeah.
It's the most diverse place I've ever lived. I think there's about 180 nationalities represented here.
Wow, that's amazing.
Yeah, it is insanely diverse. The local population is only 300,000 people. Like, there's only 300,000 Qatari people. The rest of the people here have a total population of about 3 million from everywhere else. Wow. Everyone coming here is an economic migrant, including us. The reason we're here is because we can find work. The work is better paid. And that goes across the board, whether you are cleaning someone's house or you are teaching or working in oil and gas or whatever. Everyone's here because the money is better. So yeah, I mean, camels then, pretty early on I decided, okay, let's go find the camels. And I found that there was a racing like district almost, so just west of the city, because Qatar is a very small country, one city, Doha, the capital, and everything else outside of that is basically just desert and small settlements, farms, that sort of thing. And I had my husband drive me out and just drop me off in the middle of the racing.
Good luck.
Pick me up later, it'll be fine. And so I kind of just wandered around, and it's just yards, camels as far as the eye can see, racing track at the top. And I'm just wandering around, this white girl in the desert heat, like, hi, can you train me to do what you do, to guys who spoke no English? So I'm there with my phone and the translation, and they just did not understand what was happening.
But I suppose at that same time that you probably only saw males, like there was no females, I assume, at the racing track.
No, not at all. So here is where I got my first kind of taste of like gender division, because in the city it doesn't feel like that. Yeah. Even though at my job I'm teaching females only at segregated education at the state university, not everywhere, but there. So some places are a little bit more traditional than others. Some are really not. Some are much more westernized than you would perhaps imagine. But I mean, that's just the effects of global culture, I think. But yeah, out in the traditional kind of farming communities, yeah, there's not a lot of women, not a lot of white women wandering around anyway. So these guys very much thought I was here to just take a few selfies with a cute camel, which I was, obviously, but then there's like other steps to that. And once I had my photo, they just stood there like, why you want tea? Sure. And an education, please.
Yeah.
And they were just like, but where is your husband? I was like, he will be back later. Don't worry. I've got one. But they just could not. I mean, they took me to the racing, to the track, but they were like, really, you need to like hide. We can't take a girl to the track. It was very uncomfortable for them. Like you could see they were visibly uncomfortable having someone around that wasn't a tourist. I mean, I was a total tourist, but I was trying not to be. I was trying to learn. Yeah. And this wasn't working out. So my first challenge was trying to find somebody who would be willing to teach me. And I've been here nearly 5 years now, and I still haven't found anyone that would be willing to do that for me. So what ended up happening was
there really is. So what I'm hearing is like you obviously you went to a Middle Eastern country assuming that you'd be able to learn all the camel things, but it turns out that it was much harder than what you anticipated.
No, for sure. Like I mean, it was a place of total ignorance. I wouldn't have been able to go and do all of those things if I'd been a little bit more savvy about like, well, men aren't going to want women to come to the yards. I was just like, nope, I can do this. I don't know, like it's just one of those situations where the logic and the cultural framework you've got from being a Westerner does not work. And I don't think I offended anybody, but it was just too unusual, like just too not what they
suspicious, do. Maybe even suspicious. Like
maybe. I don't know. I mean, and it's funny because I also didn't tell a lot of people that this is what I was trying to do. So I mean, I could have maybe achieved that knowledge quicker had I talked to my students about it, perhaps, because later I'm finding out the female students, they don't have a lot of involvement with the camels. It's very much a man's game, a boy's hobby. And I've had even some female students, particularly from the old Bedouin families, who are quite I want to say like violently, but like they seem very against camels almost, because it takes the father's attention away. It's something the guys do with their sons. That's it almost represents a division within the family, because the animals, the camels, the horses.
How
and so on.
Fascinating! This is so fascinating. Like what I'm hearing with like just that last statement you said is that for females it feels like it represents the division. So it's really hard for them to talk about camels or even want to be interested in camels, because it's always been such a one gender, I suppose, industry. Like that is so, and from a Westerner's perspective, like you're going into there, Amy, you just wouldn't think of those things, because we are more privileged in our countries, where, you know, it's sort of like you can turn up, and if you want to learn something, you generally can learn it, even if you're being teased for it or ridiculed or whatever. You're just going to get in there and do it. But that, what you're facing and what you face is completely different.
Yeah, I mean, it did become kind of eye-opening, and I think one of the things that I'm very grateful for in pursuing camels within Qatar, but also outside, but particularly in this context within, is that it's just given me this extra insight into the culture here that I think, unless you bothered to go and do something like this, you wouldn't necessarily ever see. I think you could quite happily come here and get your job, live in the city, and live in a fairly, well, I say white expat bubble because I am white, but whatever your expat bubble is, you could come, you could never interact with locals, you could never be invited to someone's home, because there's just so few of them to start with. It's a very private culture. And just the way that the society is set up in the strata of the economy and the jobs that people are doing, what jobs certain nationalities can do here, which is, it's very, very organized. You could come here and live 10 years and never really see much of the local culture. And some people don't want to, and that's fine. They're here to make their money. They come, they go, they leave. There's a lot of turnover here. It's a very transient sort of place because of that. And I do think that, although it wasn't my aim, like trying just to get hold of a camel has led me into these different scenarios. And I'm thankful for that, because it's certainly given me something that I'm going to go away with that I wouldn't have had I not tried to ride a camel or learn how to. So as it happened, after about another year, we had a teaching assistant come work for the department from a fairly prominent family. I mean, not one of the royal families, but certainly a fairly well-established family, a very large family in Qatar. And my friend who knew what I was doing was working quite closely with her, and she mentioned it. And so this girl, Reem, she said, "Oh, come to my family's farm. We have camels. You can meet them and play with them. They belong to my grandmother."
So she was really willing to back your idea.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, she was wonderful. And thanks to her and her family is the only reason that I've managed in this time to get where I am. So they had some ponies they had for their children. So I was helping out with that a little bit, because that's something I do know, in exchange for kind of some access to their camels, which I think they would have given me anyway. But, you feel like you have to bring something to the table. Otherwise you are just a tourist in someone's life. And so her grandmother, and this ended up being a difference as well, because while my very young female students who are, university age, were reporting back on this kind of, camels is something we're locked out of as a generation. The older generation, the grandmother of this family, who's like she's like 160, I don't know, like she's old. And she is traditionally Bedouin. She's not from Qatar originally. I mean, we have to remember that these states were only officially set up in the 1970s. And so this woman, the grandmother of this family, she came on the back of a camel to this region, as part of the region. So she was born in the Empty Quarter, which is the big desert going through Saudi and the Emirates. Born in a tiny village, back of a camel in a howdah, those big boxes that used to go on the back of camels, traveled from there to Saudi to get married, and then they came up the north and settled in Qatar. So she has a real connection with camels, which goes way back generationally. And then you start to see a closer relationship between women and camels, because of the Bedouin have a slightly more, I would not say equal, but I would say there is, because of the nature of the lifestyle. And you can see this in this kind of comparisons you could draw between like Mongolian culture. I've talked to Baikal about this. There's no division when everybody has to pitch in, or there's not so much, well, there's division, of course, there's men's work, there's women's work, but everybody is certainly involved because it's not a big enough society.
And so what I'm hearing here is that like the camel they relied on for their lifestyle really back in, 100 years ago or whatever, but now it's more of a privilege to have camels. They're more of a hobby, and the women are kind of like, well, you go do women thing and we'll stick to our man thing, which is the camels. So how fascinating though that women had such, and I, again, like you said, I hear this a lot about Bedouin cultures in Mongolia and Israel, is that initially the women had a lot to do with the camels, even in India, I remember when we were in India that I saw the first woman I saw dealing with a camel. She was walking a string of camels, 5 camels down the main street of somewhere near Rajasthan. And I was like, that's the first woman I've seen deal with camels, but she was obviously traditional. And that's the first thing that came to my head. I'm like, she must be traditional because you don't see that.
You see, it's interesting how these practices and knowledges have been lost just within a couple of generations.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember the first time that I did a big walk with my camel, I took him from one farm to another and surprised the family. I was like, look, I can walk my camel, and turned up. And for lunch, they weren't expecting me. And this is shortly after India. I was like, I had all the confidence. So I was like, I'm going to do a 16K walk with my camel. And I rocked up and all the kids are running around going, oh my God, Amy, will the camel kick us? Will it bite us? And I was like, you're the camel people, you tell me. But they're not. That generation is not anymore because they have very much become cityfied. And I think the camel now is this attempt to bridge a gap heritage-wise. You see a lot of camels sort of standing around, not doing much. But people keep them. People want them as like a symbol of not just status, because it does mean a lot to own camels. They're not cheap animals here to buy. And they do use them for racing. And then there's things like obviously the beauty contests in the Middle East, which they're famous for. But there is this, I think, an attempt to maintain some connection to the heritage. And obviously then, like me at 15, not being impressed with anything, the kids are probably not that impressed right now. They may be and maintain it later, particularly the boys. But I think there is it's quite a sad sense of the girls losing that connection in Qatar. I don't know if that's the same everywhere. I mean, I've recently been in contact with someone who I would like to go and do interviews with in the Emirates, Abu Dhabi Camel Riding Club. And they have a ladies' team, which is very interesting.
How fascinating.
And there are local Emirati women on that team. So I was thinking, this might just be an expat thing, because I saw some images on their Instagram. But having spoken to a couple of the girls who are involved, there are local women who are now riding camels for the racing. And I'm just like, this is amazing. This is what it needs.
And see, you don't hear about these things. And I want to go into your story a little bit now on, for those listening, is that Amy has started, I think, well, you can explain better than me, but because of your story, somehow you got fascinated with this culture of women dealing with camels, which has been buried, whether that be for centuries or whether it just be they're just not speaking about it, or because there's such a minority of men dealing with camels. So if you could just go into how you got to speaking to women all over the world who are working with camels.
So it's got two main strands to it. And the first is a very selfish, me needing to know.
Yeah, that's how all good things start.
No, for sure. I mean, so like I said, I met this family, and still there's no one still available to train me up. So the father of the family eventually said, look, I think the best thing for you to do is to buy a camel, keep it here, which is where he still lives. And again, I thank this family so much for enabling me to pursue this. But he said the only way you're going to be able to do this is get one and learn on the job. So we did. He helped me buy a camel. My camel is an ex-riding camel from the racetrack, not a racing camel, but one. They're called a jalisa. They're called the babysitting camels. They ride them out with the racing camels to keep them calm. Yep. So as you can imagine, my camel is very big. He's very docile. He's very trained. Also, I thought. And so this camel came home on the back of a pickup truck, winched out with a crane, put in the field. As you do, all very traditional, to crane your camel into your yard.
Yeah.
And then
Yeah.
I'm sat there with this camel. So this is the beginning of 2018. And I was like, now what? Now what? Now what? And the first thing that happened, I mean, and this is how I ended up meeting you and Russell, is that I had this camel that was in theory trained, but I was not trained. So my camel realized this quickly, and he was like, oh, this girl does not know what she's doing. I'm just going into early retirement. There's no need for me to cush. She wants to groom me. She will buy a step ladder to do so. I had to, because I couldn't get hold of him. He would just put his head up and oh, now what? So I had this camel for 6 months, not knowing what. I used to just go and look at him. I was like, I'm not learning anything. I'm not doing anything. What have I done? I might have to sell him. I don't know what to do. I had offers for him. People wanted to buy him for eating because he's so big. I was like, maybe. I guess we'll have to, because I don't know what I'm doing. And then I got in touch with you for your India trip. So I made this decision. I was like, I'm going to go to India. I'm going to see what I learn. And if I come back and I haven't been able to apply any of that training, then I think I've reached a dead end. And I came to India and I met you and I met Russell. And the majority of people on your India trip were women, which was amazing. And Andrew, honorary woman for the week.
Yes, the honourable Andrew.
So my first learning experience was in this team of women who all of you had more experience than I did, and different types of experience. You had Carrie, who was veterinary, and Michaela, who was working on her, like, I mean, she was just amazing. Just, I can handle any animal, no matter how rabid, because she has like a zoo experience and stuff. I mean, everybody taught me something on that trip. And I had my own experiences. I don't know how much we can talk about that, but I had my experiences on that trip that I came back and I was like, my camel's easy. And now I have, and the thing was, It got my confidence. It took me a while to learn that it was me that was being trained, and whether the camels got trained in India or not was by the by, because I was there to train myself. And I came back and applied lessons from you, lessons from Carrie, lessons from Michaela, and it changed everything. Me and my camel now, we're fine. We're good. I can get him to do just about anything. But what I thought from that was, I mean, while I was there, this idea that I was coming from a place of complete ignorance, complete loneliness, because despite the fact that I am in a culture that is suffused with camels, I am still an outsider. I kind of have like a foot in either and end up falling down the gap between these two cultures, because I still cannot have somebody here that's very knowledgeable that can just pass on their lessons. And I was quite frustrated with that, and also frustrated with the lack of information that's available online, or it's conflicting. There's not a lot in English. The majority of it's very, very scientific, which is not what I'm after at the moment. So how to do other than to maybe just start contributing myself, and writing and reading is something that I can do, talking is something that I can do. So and so I started there. I kind of had the idea that there are women out there, men as well, of course, but I think men have problems getting their narratives out, where women, historically have done. And I also found it's just an immediate bond, I think, when I meet a woman who's doing something that's quite unusual. I immediately want to hear all about it. And so that's where it came from. Firstly, it was a way to talk to other women that have done stuff that's similar to what I'm doing, or even wildly different from what I'm doing. What challenges did you meet? How did you get over them? How did you do this? How? So I can learn. But at the same time, they're not keeping that knowledge for myself, because who does that benefit? Me, obviously. But thinking back to where I was 3 years ago, I would have been desperate for this sort of information to exist. So I just saw.
And keeping knowledge to yourself is like like getting some treasure and burying it for no one ever to know where X marks the spot is. Like, it's, you know, like that's why, and especially for the minority groups like women and people of color and things like that, and even both, like getting, like, you just, and thank God for social platforms in most of the ways, because that's often how we find these people. But on the same platform, like, it's just so fascinating to hear all the different things and how you can do things this way, and people come up with a different idea and they're doing that over in some other country. Like, I find that incredibly inspiring, and I mean, that's why we often do these interviews for our podcast, is because they're inspiring, they're different, and we're telling a story that would not have been heard otherwise.
Yeah. And that's the thing. I think when I started talking to these women, it's not like some of them haven't had coverage. I mean, like Baikal, for example, she's received a lot of, I mean, you worked with her in Mongolia right at the beginning. She's received a lot of coverage as she's been doing her Steps to the West journey, Mongolia to London with her camels. But still, I mean, this is a story that outside of that, the camel community is still very, very small. The English-speaking camel community is still quite small.
Yes.
And that has its uses, it really does, because you're able to get access, recommendations for help. I would have been able to go to Jordan on my own if I'd not had people noticing that I was wanting to go on Instagram and then helping me by putting me in contact with people. So but then, like, communicating that out, because how are people gonna learn to come into the culture, to come into the fold, unless they can hear these stories of how it's done, to know that it's possible. And then just because these stories should be told, you know, like, some people are not necessarily themselves wishing to, not wishing to exactly, but maybe have never thought to communicate the story. They might
tell their story,
the value of their story.
Absolutely.
And I think,
yeah,
like, for example, one of the more recent ones that I did was with Lulu, Cameleer kid, who grew up with camels on the road, on wagons throughout Australia. And although she is sharing some of her stuff, she's never sat down and done a formal interview. So that was super, like, just intimate and nice to be able to communicate the meat of her story, which is quite an emotionally racking one. And then you've got people like Megumi Takichi, who is a Japanese hairdresser who went to Rajasthan and started learning the camel clipping. She did find a guy to teach her, very jealous, but she went and won some contest for it. The problem with her, not problem exactly, but she doesn't speak English. So her interview, very short and sweet, but being able to help somebody get there, you know, we're very privileged because English being this very dominant language, it's almost, I feel like this from, like, the academic world that I'm in, sometimes if you don't say it in English, it's like you haven't said it, right?
Yes.
So being able to kind of get stories from one language into another is part of it as well, I think, because these stories won't get lost.
Absolutely. I am just, there's so much going on in my head about this story. I mean, we're talking about you know, equality, really, and gender diversion. We're talking about cultural awareness. We're talking about so many things, and I'm loving this conversation because they're all, like, as a person who speaks English, you know, possibly even white, we have a lot of privileges. And even though, interest in your story, how you went to a culture, you know, where they're mostly men dealing with camels, they probably looked at you and gone, oh, she's joking. You know, she's got to be joking, because this is men's business. And probably for them it would have been like a man going to a women's dinner party or whatever they do culturally over there, and the women going, what are you doing here? So this is a fabulous conversation, and raising the voices and raising the stories of people who don't have the same privileges as us, like speaking English, like being white, because let's face it, you know, we know that there is problems with, you know, racism in our world, and certain people being judged by the color they are or the culture that exists, that they're part of. So, but all this, everything you're saying is focused around camels. Like, can you even who on God's planet here would even think that all of this is the center of all of this is camels? It's just insane.
Yeah, I mean, it's yeah, and like I say, it was not well thought out. This thing started happening before I realized. I mean, I'm just following camels at this stage. I really am, in the sort of literal, figurative sense. It's determined all of my travel. I mean, I think this is why I've had a less productive pandemic, because when you realize that your work depends on travel and then you are confined to your house, it's very difficult. Like, oh yeah, travel writing doesn't really work. So it's a tricky year, but I mean, I'm raring to get started again. But camels became to sort of define, it's like, oh well, okay, so my travel now becomes related to where I can go to see camels, and then just collect stories along the way. I got divorced a couple of years ago as well, so I think part of this has been about, from a personal standpoint, gaining independence. After, you know, I mean, it only struck me after my divorce when I came to India, which was, I think, my first trip I'd taken alone. And I was like, well, yeah, I mean, I've been in a relationship my entire adult life, so I can think that I'm as independent as I like, but then you realize you're actually not. So, or you're doing it for the first time on your own. So a lot of this kind of
and the camel did that for you because you had this fascination. You were led by the camel. I love this. Like, I love this so much because, yeah, and this is why we call ourselves Camel Connection, because there's so many different connections you can have with camels, and maybe they've saved somebody's life because they were in deep, dark depression and they found camels, or maybe somebody's just been inspired and done a big walk across the continent, or, you know, there's so many things that camels can connect us to. And for everyone listening, you know, what's your connection to camels? And we got people, you know, within our community, our students, our members, just everyone's got a different story. And it doesn't matter whether you just want a pet camel or whether you do want to walk across the continent with a camel. It all matters, and it's all connected. And really, we're all connected because of that. And I really want to ask you about, through the interviews that you've done, and I know you've got a blog happening, so we'll definitely give people the links to go and read these amazing interviews. So what have you found is the most common theme in these interviews with these women who work with camels?
There seems to be, and it sometimes was directly stated, such as with the interview with Abby Brooke, which was my first interview. So Abby, who's done the walking with camels in aid of autism awareness in Africa. So she's walking in Kenya. And so she was the first person to mention it directly, but I think it's come up so many times. There's actually two things that people have either said directly or they've alluded to. And I think this is perhaps something that is characteristic of women. I don't think you would hear this as much with men. Not that there aren't men doing wonderful journeys. I mean, right now there's John, Elliot, there's Andrew, I think, has just finished another one. So it's not that there aren't guys crisscrossing the world with their camels, but from the women who have been doing it, this concept of camels leading to a sense of freedom. Now, it doesn't necessarily need to be camels that are the catalyst for that, but I think the way Abby put it, she was quoting actually from Robin Davidson, who I think everybody in the camel world will have been familiar with.
Yeah.
Her track.
And if you don't, come on. Like, come on.
What are you doing? About the way that women have to really leave their comfort zone, or to put themselves in discomfort or almost in danger sometimes in order to achieve freedom. So that the step for women to achieve freedom is something that it involves a lot of risk. And this is something that personally I've come up against. I mean, it took me a year to decide to go to Jordan because I wanted to do it alone. And I was so frustrated by the books I was reading about men that had been to Jordan or at North Africa on their own and just like rocked up and just like no plan, you know, whereas I felt I needed all of these things in place: emergency numbers, satellite phone, like just in case, because you're a woman, very different. And that doesn't matter whether you are privileged, affluent, or, you know, self-empowered or whatever, there is huge risk involved in pursuing a lot of this in a way that I think men don't face and often aren't aware of, because they don't face the same things. So freedom, personal freedom, and the kind of if you can do it and if you can achieve what you want to do with camels, that sense of freedom and independence is incredibly empowering, and that we fight a little bit harder for it, I think, than men do. And then the other thing is that there's a collective aspect to women's stories, which I don't think I've seen as much in, and I don't want to set up like a false dichotomy between men and women, because I don't think that's necessarily useful, but I do think that the women that I've spoken to tend to be more aligned with a kind of collective either empathy or communication or freedom that I think, I mean, I think you said it in the interview that I had, that even healing comes collectively. That person can't heal on their own. They can't be independent on their own. It's like even independence is something that is collectively enabled for women. And I think that's kind of where we are with feminism as well, is that we're not, feminism shouldn't be seen as something that is a personal empowerment. Just because I feel empowered and free doesn't mean that that's the feminist project has succeeded. Feminism is a collective thing. And
it includes men.
Yeah, it does, of course. It's the most collective thing that there should be. And in a way, perhaps then camels and camel cultures themselves being necessarily collective. I mean, it's a very kind of like basic metaphor to pull from that. But I mean, it's a herd animal. The cultures that arise around them are very cooperative and collaborative. So they themselves are collective. And I think it lends itself well to the pursuit of female independence and empowerment, even if women are shut out of it a lot of the time in certain places. But I think that in itself is a symptom of modernity, because I think if you look back far enough in most cultures, you have women more involved, and it'd be nice to sort of get back to that, or just for women to feel like they have the opportunity to access it if they so choose. So it'd be nice to see a bit more of that. So yeah, I think throughout the threads of the interviews that I've had, freedom, the risks of that for women, regardless of social status or colour of skin, that seems to be something that women everywhere are facing. But even that in itself is a mark of collective experience. So it's, I like that. I like the fact that even the fears bring us closer together because we're all feeling them.
So my next question is, what do you think from interviewing the women that you have interviewed and from the experiences that you've had in a different culture other than the one that you were brought up in, what do you think is going to bring, and we're talking specifically about translates to most things, what do you think is going to enable women to have camel information more accessible to them in a variety of cultures?
I mean, I think I don't want to blow the trumpet of what I'm trying to do too strongly, but I do think making stories available, and not just, me making other people's stories available and building a website off the back of other people's stories. I mean, I'm trying to add other things to my project, but right now the interviews were what set it off. But I think I think women have to, and hopefully by seeing the attention that this kind of thing brings, if I can share someone's story and people are responding well to it, if people can see that, and then we can maybe bypass the need for an interviewer, people wanting to share their own stories themselves. I think that might be an interview. I'm very new to the interviewing game, but it does seem like that could be something that might be the logical end of that, is eventually we could maybe do away with the need for interviewers because people should be sharing their own stories. I mean, I teach writing to young Arab women, and I usually start my semesters by trying to piss them off by saying like, it's very useful. I mean, teaching under the Trump years has been very useful because there's been a lot of anti-Muslim rhetoric, and there's always anti-Muslim women rhetoric, whether it's about the hijab or it's about oppression or it's about equality. So I just try to fling these things at them very early on and say, look, this is what everyone will say about you if you don't say stuff about yourselves.
Oh my God, that statement. You just said it. You just said it.
There is always going to be someone willing to tell your story for you, in, you know,
yes,
in the YouTube comment section. If you don't if you don't self-represent. So, you know, it's a bit of a risky tactic, because I'm sort of saying, well, this is what everyone thinks of Muslims, and like, can you correct me? Tell me, educate me, because this is what, if you don't step in and speak up, someone else will fill that gap, and it'll be incorrect, it'll be misinformation, so don't let people do it. I mean, I would hope that in any language would be useful, because at the local level it needs to be in your local language. Obviously, having more stories from more places, so maybe an interviewer's role could be more about translation as well. I mean, I don't speak any language well enough to be translating, but I know there are people out there. And I think if you do have the ability to translate and to help stories get from one language into another so that they can be shared, this is obviously going to help, because it's more exposure.
And I'd like to add here, like, for those listening, is, you know, sharing doesn't have to be on massive platforms. It doesn't have to be on social media. It could be at a family dinner on a Sunday night. Is, you know what, I just heard this lady's doing this with camels. It was so interesting. And this was the most fascinating part of her story. Like that is how we used to do it before social media and before YouTube and before everything. You know, we'd call up a friend and go, oh my God, guess who I just met, or whatever. Like, that's how stories, a lot of people just assume that a story, because we've got this false illusion that social media is the world, people think that that's the only way that things can be told now, but it's actually more of a home basis thing. It's like how we set our kids up with excellent values is by telling them stories, is by sharing our experiences, is by, you know, manners and all that stuff. It's the same with sharing stories. It doesn't have to be on big platforms. We're lucky enough to have, you know, a big platform for a camel business, I suppose you could say. But, you know, we've got a podcast, we've got a YouTube channel, and that's our favorite place to share this sort of information. But also privately, we share stuff with, you know, people down the street. If they want to know something about camels or what we do, we share it. And we're like, you know, and they're like, are there even other camel people out there? And we're like, yeah, let me tell you about some of them.
Yeah, I mean, this is one of the reasons that I have over the years become quite frustrated with academia. And I mean, I know there is a shift in academia now to more like open access publishing, but it has been very frustrating for me to find knowledge behind paywalls. And even my own work, even my own academic research, which is originally nothing to do with camels, to see that behind paywalls which exclude people from learning I think is problematic.
Unless you pay.
Exactly. So I mean, if, you know, if something's worth knowing, if something's worth sharing, then it should be enabled to be shared freely. And as widely as possible. So I think, it doesn't need to be on a digital platform, but people shouldn't be, like you say, people shouldn't be burying treasure.
Well, I mean, that's our story, you know, like Russell when I met him, he had all this incredible knowledge on camels. And I'm like, why aren't you sharing this information? Like, and that was always his dream. He just didn't know how. And if you don't know how, it's just that matter of just constantly having that thought in your head of how am I going to share this, and someone will pop up in your life. It's just how it works. But and the same thing, you know, if we know something about camels, we have to share it. We feel like that is exactly why we're on this planet. Like, if we find out new information about camels, we share it, whether it be on the podcast here, whether that be in our paid memberships or our paid course, you know, it's going to be shared. And, you know, so it's so important to share this information. And one of the pitfalls we found ourselves in, even myself and Russell, even knowing information about camels when I met him, was just still the lack of information. how do I keep my camels healthy outside of a desert environment? Somebody tell me. Nobody could tell me. Again, like you, Amy, without trying to read a science dictionary or whatever I was reading in foreign languages. I had no clue. I had to try and piece it together ourselves. And that is exactly why we started the Cameleer membership, which I know you're a part of, Amy. And just that it's, yeah, like, it frustrates me. It frustrates me that people can lock away that information, and you are literally and what I say about us particularly is it would be selfish for us to keep this information to ourselves, because we think it's valuable, it's worked for us, it's going to work for other people too.
Well, how would it benefit you to keep it? I mean, your whole entire business model is, you know, it exists on people wanting to get into this, to have camels, to give you the work. So it benefits everybody. It's
It does.
you know, more people are knowledgeable, the more sharing, the more interest, the more people there will be. So it actually creates its own momentum. And I think that's really important.
Well, this is it, behind the scenes. And I think I even said this in my interview with you, because you interviewed me for your blog. And that was like, you know, secretly behind the scenes, you know, we do have a major issue with wild camels in Australia. Yes, they are being killed by the government. Millions of dollars are being spent on that. Could we, you know, somehow manage to get a big landmass together and try and save all these camels? We could, but we think the more sustainable way is educating people on camels, so more people want camels and know that they're able to have camels, because we've simplified everything in the camel world, whether that be training or whether that be, you know, husbandry and care. So that is like, it's a slower route. Absolutely. You know, we can't just go out there and save all these camels because we don't have the land to keep them. But this is a slower journey. And I always think it's the tortoise that wins the race, you know, on this terms. And I think us talking about this gender division with camels and two different genders, and even the non-binary, like, it's about, let's share more information so it can be more accessible, so that more people can have camels, because there are a lot of camels if you look.
Yeah, I mean, no change can happen without conversation. I mean, like that, on the smaller level, the larger level, without communication, without conversation, and without I suppose, the sharing of stories to get that started. So yeah, I mean, I agree with you.
So before we wrap up here, tell us a little bit about your plans moving forward. Obviously, you're going to continue sharing women's stories as much as you possibly can. Travel is something we all want to do, but it's possibly off the cards for you. And finally, where people can find these amazing stories that you've written up about these women.
Yeah, I mean, I almost said no to this interview because I've been so unproductive. I don't know. Whoever got thin and creative during the pandemic, I don't know you. I went the other way. I just went slow and fat and quiet, and yeah. I mean, like I said, travel is a big part of my my impetus for going out and finding. So I have to get out of Qatar if I want to meet people that are doing what I do. So, and that, although that is possible via Zoom, I do like to go and see what people are doing and feel a bit more hands-on. I don't like to write about places that I haven't been. So having travel plans so interrupted, and that's an incredibly privileged thing to say. But it's yeah, I mean, I know everybody is and honestly, actually, the first travel I'll be doing is going home and seeing my family where there are 0 camels. But that's obviously priority for me. And hopefully that'll be possible with the vaccines rolling out. In terms of camel-related travel, I would like to get over to the Emirates. The blockade has finished. We've been under blockade from the other GCC neighbours for the last 4 years. That's just stopped. This is very exciting because travel to Saudi Arabia and the Emirates is back open now and possible after vaccines have started, of course. So I would very much like to get out and find out about these Emirati women who are joining the camel racing club in Dubai and Abu Dhabi. That would be my first trip plan. I have a few interviews that I am about to share on the website. One with Ilse Kohler-Rollison from Camel Charisma in India, who is endlessly inspiring. And her work, her more recent work, has been very, very interesting. So I've got an interview with her to share, an interview with Ursula Winberger from Austria, who is a camel hematologist. And it's probably the most sciencey of the interviews that I've done so far, but has been just another perspective that I wouldn't be able to access alone. And her information has been absolutely just crucial to me adding to my picture of camels. And personally, I'm working with my own camel very, very slowly, because life. But we are working together. My aim with my own camel is to do some longer walk alone, and within the country, a very small country, able to walk around it with my camel in its entirety. So I have small, slow projects. The website, of course, has been up for about 6 months, I think now. I think there's about 8 or 9 interviews up there, and I'm adding to that slowly. The project's called One Woman Caravan, which on the one hand represents the fact that I am really just one woman caravan, walking my camel around and about, but also the collective nature of that, in that we're bringing women together under this one woman umbrella, allows us to converse and share stories and experiences. So the website is still skinny and still evolving, but it's up there, and there's a few interviews with excellent women that I've met and learned from, including yourself. And I have to thank you as well, because I think you and Russell and Camel Connection really kicked everything off for me. It changed a lot. Without my trip to India with you, I don't think I'd be here. My camel would have been eaten. So I might have a nice handbag, but I don't. It's possible. I'm in the right country for it. So I mean,
this is exactly why we do what we do. Is like, we got no secrets to hold here about camels, and like we even say this to people that want to start camel businesses. We are behind you 110%. Like, we don't see competition. We're just like, we see camel and we want more camel, no matter where you are in the world. So I love what you've been doing, and I love that your own interest, because that's how it always starts, and you took that into something to share not only your story but everyone else's story too, and everyone that you've met so far. And I can just see this being a continued evolution, because there's so many stories. When you start looking for these stories, they pop up more and more.
No, I was amazed. I mean, I was amazed that there were so many women. I mean, I've completed a number, but I have 3 times as many still to approach. I mean, it's crazy how many women have that connection, and that makes me think there's just going to be
interestingly enough, that most of our students and our members in our academy, I would say 90% of them are women.
Exactly.
Women love camels.
They'll all be getting an email from me eventually.
Oh, exactly. So we're just bringing them all together. So what is the website? Just tell everyone what the website is so they can read these interviews.
It's onewomancaravan.com, and I'm also on Instagram at onewomancaravan.
Fabulous. And I really want you to continue sharing these stories, and we're just so pleased to have you on here to share a bit of your story and how you're sharing other people's stories. So thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Tara. It's lovely to see you.